Hi everyone, in this video we're going to be talking about closures, what they are and why they matter in JavaScript. Now, in order to understand closures, you first need to understand scope and grasp that concept. And with scope, what that refers to is wherever a variable can be created and accessed. And so we'll see that here. Scope refers to where a variable exists or can be accessed. And within scope, you have categories. And one of those categories is function scope. And with function scope, that essentially just refers to when a variable can be accessed or exist only within a function. You also have global scope as another one, and that's essentially your entire um, space that you can access a variable, your entire code when a variable can be accessed everywhere. But in this case, I really want to focus in on function scope when a variable can only be exist or be accessed within a function. Now, to go into this a bit more, I have an example. And here with function scope, we have a function called packBag. And we have within the function, we have a variable assigned to a value of apple. And we want to show this apple text within the console. And that's what we're doing here, console.log snack. And we're actually calling that function with packBag here. Now underneath, we're trying to do the same thing. We're trying to show the variable snack in the console, but we're trying to access variable outside of the function. And what happens is when we try to do this, you'll actually get an error. And that error is because console.log is trying to access a variable that it can't or shouldn't because it's within function. And so that's why it's saying snack is not defined, because it's nowhere it can see. It's private in a way. So in order to make this run, we got to comment this out, and then we can go ahead and do this again, and you'll see apple in the console. Now, with scope and function scope, it really goes into this idea of closures. And with closures, essentially that is when a function can remember a variable from the environment it was created in, even after that environment is gone. And we have an example of that to better understand this idea of closures. And here we have a function, create counter. Within the function, we have a variable as we did before. We have a variable snack. Now, this time we have a variable of count. And we're returning a function afterwards. And this function returned after essentially is going to increment the count and then console.log that number within the console. So really all that create counter is doing is just showcasing or creating, declaring and assigning count to 0. And we're only running it once. As we can see here, create counter is only called once and then stored in a variable counter. And then counter is, since that is a function, we're calling it 3 times because we returned a function, right? And counter is the one that's going to increment the count. And you'll see that when we run this, it actually works. And we get back 1, 2, 3. And so this is this idea of closures, when a function can remember a variable from the environment it was created in. This function was created within this environment of create counter. And so it's able to remember or access the count within it. And essentially it's creating this private state. Even though create counter is gone, that is no longer, that environment is finished. And so we see create counter runs once, it returns a new function, but that function still has access. The counter still has access to count even though create counter is finished, and that is what we call a closure. Now, what is the benefit of this? And essentially, to get a better idea of this, is essentially it is a way to keep your code organized and clean, and when you're working on websites or apps. So if you were to, work on a project where you're tracking how many times the user clicks a button without using a global variable, well, you can use a closure for that. If you were building a pricing calculator for a client, you can keep all of the logic for the math private using a closure for that calculator. And it really goes into, you can think about a sandbox example. We talk about sandboxes all the time, or I use sandboxes in my tutorials. And this idea of a sandbox is essentially you have toys or tools for children that you put in the sandbox, like a shovel, a bucket, maybe a car. And you can let children play inside the sandbox, but they can't necessarily go in, reach in from the outside of the box to change the toys directly or try to play with them. They have to be in the sandbox in order to have all the fun. The same goes for closures. You can expose a function that interacts with private variables, but nothing else can touch them. So that gives you, one, more control, and it keeps your code clean and reliable. And so that's what we're seeing here, that we have the sandbox and we're able to still access count even though it's that environment's really ended because we only ran create counter once and then run counter. Now, closures are great for a lot of things, but I want to clarify what it isn't so you even more clearly understand it. Closures are not, just because something's hidden, as we see here, this count is hidden, doesn't mean it's secure. What happens is JavaScript runs, in the browser, so it's on the client side, it's not on the back end, and so anyone can just view your code. So this isn't secure, this isn't security. Closure is really just more for your own benefit, keep things private within your code, but they're not a way to protect any secrets like a password or an API key that needs to be stored somewhere like on a backend server. So big distinction there. It's more for organization and being able to organize your code cleanly and not have other parts of the code mess up other parts of the code by keeping clean divisions with this idea of closures. And so that's everything. And really, to just quickly recap on this, we learned today about scope, and scope is where you can have variables exist and also be accessed. And then within scope, you have different categories, subcategories. One of those is function scope, where you can only access a variable within a function. And then within that idea of function scope, you have closures. And so closures is when a function keeps access to variables from its original environment. And you can use closures to organize your code and manage private state. Closures don't make your data secure from users. It's just cleans up and protects your code within your app for your benefit. And that's it. That's everything. Thanks so much for watching. If this helped you out, feel free to give the video a like and subscribe if you are learning JavaScript with me. And we'll see you in the next video. Thanks so much.